We have a Conneely with us today. Where is he? He doesn't even hear me. He's talking over there. Michael Conneely, put your hand up. So Michael just moved to Foxford with Maggie last week. But the Conneelys are connected with the seal people and the Selkies. So do any of you know about the Selkies? No. Some of you do? Good. So now I'm from the seaside area of Bangor in County Down. And anywhere along the coast, whether it's Ireland, Scotland, even over in America, Canada and Maine, the fishermen tell stories about strange things that might happen with the seals. So I'm going to tell you one that comes from the Shetland Islands, and it's called Woman of the Sea. One summer night, a young man was walking on the sand by the sea on the Isle of Unst. He'd been all day in the hayfields, and had come down to the shore to cool himself, for it was the full of the moon, and the wind blowing fresh off the water. And as he walked along, he saw the sand shining in the moonlight, and on it, the sea people dancing. He'd never seen them before, for they show themselves as seals by day, but on this night, because it was midsummer and the full of the moon, they were dancing for joy. Here and there he could see dark patches where they'd thrown down their seal skins, but they were as clear as the moon itself, and they left no shadow. Well, he walked a little further, and his own shadow fell in front of him, and one of the fairy people stepped on it, and she turned and saw him and ran back to the sea. They all picked up their seal skins and ran back. The air was full of their soft cryings and splashings. But one of the fairy people ran hither and thither along the sands, wringing her hands as if she'd lost something. The young man looked, and he saw a patch of darkness in his own shadow. It was her sealskin. Well, he picked it up, and he hid behind a rock, and he waited to see what the sea fairy would do. Well, she stood there with her white feet in the foam, crying for her people to wait for her. But they'd gone too far to hear. And the moon shone down on her, and the young man thought she was the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen. And then she started to cry, and the sound of it was so pitiful, he could bear it no longer. So he walked up to her and he said, "What do you want, woman of the sea?" And she turned when she heard him, and for a minute he thought she might just jump into the water. She'd be afraid, but she didn't. She walked up to him and held up her two hands and said, "Give it back to me, and my people will give you the treasures of the sea." Her voice was like the waves singing in a shell. "Oh, I'd rather have you than all the treasures of the sea," he said. And though she started crying more pitifully than ever, he wasn't moved. "It's my wife you shall be," he said. "Come with me now to the priest, and I'll take you back to your own little cottage. And it's warm you'll be sitting at the coal fire, instead of swimming in the dark, cold sea." She tried to tell him about the bottom of the sea, where there comes neither snow nor darkness of night, and the waves are as warm as a river in summer. But he wouldn't listen. He picked her up in his arms, covered her with his cloak, and they were married in the priest's house. I guess I'll put my cloak on too. And then he took her back to his own little house, and she sat there by the fire, because she'd never seen fire before, and she thought it was like a strange crimson jewel. She got up when she saw it, and he said, "Have you anything as bonny as that in the sea?" And when she answered, her voice was so soft he hardly could hear her. "No, I know not what there is in the sea," he said, "but there is nothing on land as bonny as you." And for the first time, she stopped crying and sat staring into the heart of the fire. And that was the first thing she brought her children to see, for she had 3 children in the twice 7 years she lived with him. She was a good wife to him. She baked his bread and spun the wool from the fleece of a Shetland sheep, and he never mentioned the sealskin to her, nor she to him, and he thought she was content, for he loved her dearly, and she was happy with the children, but he Noticed one time when he was ploughing up above the bay, he looked down and he saw her standing at the edge of the shore and crying in a mournful voice to a great seal far out on the water. But he said nothing when he came home, for he thought it was not to wonder at if she were lonely for a sight of her own people. And as for the seal skin, he'd hidden it well. Till there came one September night, and she was inside baking bread in the kitchen. The children were out playing hide and seek among the haystacks. And suddenly she heard them shout out in excitement, and she went out. "What have you found?" she said. And they came up to her, carrying something. It's like a big cat, they said. But it's softer than a cat. Feel. And she saw her seal skin that had been hidden under last year's hay. And she stared at it. For a long time, she stood still. It was warm dusk, and the air was yellow with the afterglow of the sunset. And the birds had all flown away, and the hens were clucking in their roost. And she'd left the cottage door open, and the warm smell of the baking bread came out, and she turned to go in. But as soon as she did, a little breath of wind came across her shoulder, and it brought a sound that she heard so long, it was as if she never heard it at all. It was the sound of the sea. Away out she could hear those big waves crashing on the rocks, and closer in, little waves slipping on the shore. And she turned back and grabbed her sealskin and ran with it down to the water. And the children cried after her to wait, but she didn't hear them. And she was just out of sight when her husband came home from the byre, and the children ran to tell him what happened. "Which way did she go?" he said. "She went that way, to the sea." And he ran after her, and he was just in time to see her jump out and meet that great grey seal who was waiting for her. And he called for her not to go. And she turned, and for a minute she just floated on the surface of the waves. And then she said to him in her voice that was like the sea singing through the shells, "Fare ye well, and all good befall you, for you were a good man to me." And then she turned and dived down to the bottom of the sea, and the great seal with her. For a long time, her husband waited and watched for her to come back to him and the children. But she came no more. That's the woman of the sea.
Lovely, thank you.